Okay, so I guess the first thing, good morning. And did everybody see the agenda posted on the website? If not, I'll share my screen real quick. And just make sure that people can see it to see can you guys see it? Is it big enough?
Yep, it's great.
Just to see if there's anything that anybody else would like to add to the agenda for today. If you want to take a quick look. Any additions from anybody? All right. We'll hold on the comments from chair just as I have not heard from Rep. Lindsay. Hopefully she survived session. I'm sure she did, but we have not heard back from her. So we'll see if if she'll join in any comments that she might have. So this last month, we pulled together some information. Oh, I'm gonna have to stop share. We pulled together some information, just some additional findings, just to help maybe narrow the scope a little bit and identify if we found any issues that we wanted to address in the scope. So I'm going to try this again. It's not doing anything. Still not doing anything. Okay, here we go. Can you guys see something? Perfect. So this last month, Adam and Greg and Todd in my office did some basically playing with the data to get an idea, more information about, what issues might we find with the research. So, just to frame it up again, when we're really looking in Colorado, there are about 256,000 single family rentals. So that's kind of the big, giant kind of scope of units. And that over the last basically 12 years from 2010, there's an increase of about 16,000 single family rental units. When over the entire time frame, we saw an increase of about 423,000 housing units. In terms of share of total units, both in terms of rentals and in terms of total units, the share of single family rentals did fall. In terms of a share of total rental units from 35% to 32%, or if we look in terms of total units, from 12% to 10%. You can see that how they're kind of spread out in terms of the different types of units in the state, if that matters, if you're interested. In some of the work that we were doing, pulling from the American Community Survey, they also, their language that they use is a little bit different. So sometimes you'll see in some of the work where we'll reference these single family rentals also as single unit rentals. Similar to some other information that we shared earlier, for the US as a whole, single family or single unit rentals kind of peaked in 2014 and have fallen as a share of the total units. Just like you saw in that other, that first slide, but this gives you a better time series. So, and again, it makes a lot of sense, really recovering from the Great Recession. You saw that increase in single family rentals. And then now as a share of total, that started to slow in terms of that share back to kind of where we were pre Great Recession. And then we were able to look at different counties in the state to look at where, if we're going to focus attention on certain areas, where are those big guys? If we had the whole list, you could see that there are definitely some significant breaks in the data. And this is the first break. So this is really looking at the first largest number of single family rentals are these 9 counties. And if you can remember, kind of for Colorado as a whole, for 2022, we're at that kind of 10%. We're back to, fell from 10, from 12 to 10.7. So if we use state as an average, we can take a look. And so certainly El Paso County is higher than that average. We've got Larimer higher, which kind of makes sense with both of those in terms of thinking about the client base. So we've got university students, we've got military families. So both those could be at that higher rental interest. We've got then Boulder a little bit higher as well as significantly in Pueblo. Again, interesting, Pueblo could be housing more of the military families, also has a university, but definitely one of the higher shares in terms of the rental units. So I want you to keep some of those numbers in mind. And we can see how that same trend occurred in terms of kind of peaked at that midpoint. This is using the 5-year ACS simply because it's a little bit better than single year data for the counties, kind of peaking in that 2013 to 2017 timeframe for El Paso County. Larimer a little bit different, kind of on an increasing path. Not really what we would say declining, but holding steady in terms of those single family rentals. In terms of count, increasing share, again, kind of slightly declining in terms of that share. And then Pueblo, similar pattern. So, not too unusual, but interesting to see that pattern. Larimer may be a little bit different again with the university students, maybe a consistent demand. So then we were able to pull together, Greg pulled together some data from Adams County to give a better sense of what does Adams look like. And I think Adams County was a significant interest, especially for Rep. Lindsay as well, because I think that's part of her district. And looking at really the lion's share of LLCs. So this is an analysis of LLCs, because again, the idea of looking at corporate. And if we remember the total number of units from Adams County, it's like 181,000. If we go back, 19,000 single family rentals, 181,000 units. So of that 19,000-ish, right, we've got 4,000 showing up in LLC. So a pretty small share, right, of that 19,000 showing up as LLCs. This is kind of showing the distribution and the number of entities. So this gets to our first challenge identified. Do we care about entities in the state as a whole or entities within a county? So for example, in Adams County, we found that there are just 2 entities that have more than 100 units, but they operate in multiple counties. So to get that second entity in there, you had to go to a different county to get enough units. So really only one entity operating in Adams that had more than 100 units, and they had, I think, 118 of those 123. So again, you can see lion's share in that 5 or fewer. You get to more entities in that 6 to 10. So you get, looking at 87 owners operating in that spectrum. But really, if we were thinking about like the large and mega, not very many entities operating in that space. We were able then to take a look at who those properties belong to, and this gets to question number 2. The first one being Home Partners of America. So they are an entity that actually operates as a lease to own. So now we throw in this question that type of entity might matter, because does it matter if they are a lease to own company versus an entity that is just owning to rent or owning more as like a REIT or a different kind of an entity. So then these were some of the other ones that were operating in Adams County. So a couple of REITs, and then private equity group, this Amherst Group. I don't know, maybe somebody is more aware of how they operate. They've got a lot of entities, 45,000 in the country, but only about 45 total in Adams County. And then another big REIT, or another REIT, that Progress Residential. So maybe I'd like to stop and see if there's any comments or questions on this piece. All right.
I just think
Okay.
excellent work. Thank you for this information. This is really, really helpful.
How, on the back end, how did you group them by LLC name?
So Greg, would you like to hop on and say how you group the LLCs?
Sure thing. And I can, I'll give a quick background, and also I think just clarify one thing on that, maybe the 100+ statewide. Just to explain, first of all, we had a somewhat limited data set, so it's not actually statewide. It's a smattering of counties, which Adams County was a part of. So it was kind of an incomplete data set working with. So I want to caveat everything based on that. But then in terms of process, what I did is I did it by owner address. So because you've got your property address and your owner address and an owner name, I left out the owner name because those often change depending on the property, if it's like in an individual single purpose entity or like fund. And so I went by the owner address and then grouped the owner addresses in order to do this. So this was a kind of, in some ways, back of the napkin analysis. So I will caveat that also. There's definitely a lot more that could be, I think, done to refine it, but this was kind of a quick and dirty as approach to looking at this. The one other thing to note is with this approach in the data set we had, one thing that does pop up a lot is the addresses that often have a lot of these are actually developers who have new developments. So, and you can see that when you look at a grouping of it'll be like 400 properties in a subdivision or something like that. And so those were clearly appeared to be a new development. And so I filtered those out in this process. And when you look at it, it's often like Lennar or Pulte or a home builder too. So, which also did that. So anyway, that's a quick background on the process here.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, you had asked a question about whether it matters on a county level or state level, the way we look at the data. And I don't know how to respond to that just yet. Kind of what were you thinking? Can you elaborate more?
What was funny, I mean, it was this idea of grouping. So, I mean, this was the super beneficial part of doing this kind of back of the napkin analysis is trying to identify, all right, what issues could we have that we need to make sure we address in the scope. So you can group this by, for example, we were primarily focusing on Adams County, and you can sort by that address that he was talking about of that owner, and that gives you one piece of information. But if you grouped multiple counties, would you then get an owner with that 100 plus, for
Yeah.
example? So that was the question, because it will impact the process of the analysis.
Yeah, I think the county data is good because as far as like real estate value trends, that
Right.
tends to be more impacted at a local or county level. However, I'm thinking of our overall charge as a group, and it was, I think, on a statewide basis that we were supposed to look at this issue. So can it be both, or does it have to be either or?
Well, I think that's up for discussion, right? And it looks like Greg has some thoughts on that.
And I guess maybe not, I guess I wanted to share a little bit too, because Elizabeth and I were discussing this and I was just clarifying. And so what I was thinking about statewide when I was looking at this was really for classification. Again, it's not technically statewide, it's that grouping of or the counties that we had access to, right? So it was, again, a limited data set, but pulling in those for classifying to say greater than 100 properties owned, right? So if you were to look at, say, Invitation Homes, if you were to actually take a bigger grouping, they would probably show up as more than 100 homes, but just given, again, that kind of limited data set I was working with, they show up in more like 50 to 100 or something. So I just want to clarify that.
That makes sense. And I think it would be beneficial to see both how they're classified in a county and statewide, personally.
Yeah, no, and I think that just helps in defining the scope for the researcher, is saying how we need the data analyzed. And that gets to, another issue that I'll bring up. It's just the way that the data is so messy, because all of it is collected differently and then reported differently. And then when people aggregate the information, it's not necessarily consistent across counties. So one potential, and I'm just going to keep it kind of on this parking lot list for this task force to look at, is could we do a better job of, and I don't know how to say this, I don't want to say collecting data, but reporting information. I know that then that has a whole bunch of connections to it, like messing up people's data sets or asking them to report things differently. So I'm just going to keep it up there as the big general. It is really hard to understand what's going on without really good information. And that might be some part of a solution in the future, is just looking at how do we do that. So we were able to look at, Greg said, this kind of weird group of data. It said Adams on it, but then it had a whole bunch of counties that weren't Adams as part of the data set. But then we were also able to look at Boulder, because I was really curious about Boulder. It was in that list of top 9 counties with single family rentals, but beyond a doubt, most of them are small entities owning fewer than 20. And so I think that that's an important also concept when we're thinking about this work. And like Frankie mentioned, like impact on the market, that it really is these, and you saw it in Adams as well, it's really these small entities that own a majority of the single family rental market. It's not these large entities. And that's all that previous research also showed. That one interesting piece here as well is that then, in terms of pulling the data together, there was only one entity that owned more than 20 units, but then it ended up being this entity that actually buys and rehabs and resells mobile homes. But again, it still showed up in the data set. And so some of the question will be is, what do we do with these things like lease to own, rehab mobile homes that are all grouped as LLCs, as corporate owners of single family homes? So it's just thinking about how this plays into maybe future recommendations. So just some findings, and this is going to be reiterating a couple of the points that we've already brought up. One, I think it was really helpful to use the ACS data to identify counties that have a large number or share of single family rentals. This is, I think, a real quick and easy way to help, instead of having to pull data for every single county in the state, that this could help focus the attention on areas where there are lots of single family rentals. As I think we heard from the group that presented last time, I think they've got a data set of 17 and have kind of culled and cleaned 17 counties. So I think that could be useful in terms of focusing attention. Data is messy, as I've brought up. And Greg mentioned that several units showing up as records under builders' names. So that's another piece to figure out in this, is that when we're looking at single family or as corporate owners of single family entities, that there is a long period of time that the builder is the owner, and be aware that that's going to be part of the data. This is, I guess, maybe a bigger question for you guys. The legislation was written as corporate, and so we then kind of isolated this concept of LLCs. But really, LLCs are a significantly smaller group of that single family rental group. So just thinking about, one, it's a great way to filter the data to help identify entities, but it may be too limiting for you all or your preferences. And definitely excludes a lot of what you would consider the mom and pop that may own that 5 or fewer and don't register themselves as LLCs.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Just a quick question, and this might be for Greg. So I think I know the answer to this, but that's why we're here, is to ask the questions. When you talk about the other group, the non-LLC single family home rental owners, Elizabeth just said, and I tend to agree with this, that there are other types of partnership entities and such, but is it fair to say the vast majority of the non-LLC single family home rental providers are individuals who own the home in their name, as opposed to some other corporate entity that we've filtered out?
Yeah, again, I didn't check for, I didn't look that specifically. That's just given kind of time constraints and how much I dug into the data. But I think could quickly add common corporate LPs, INCs, et cetera, just to see if those pop up. But in terms, when you look through these, the majority are names and trusts, and the trusts are maybe, I didn't look specifically at those, but given that those are usually individuals, I suspect they're probably individual owners. And yeah, the majority of I suspect though, a lot of the time when you're talking about these, there are a lot that are just individual names and the owner. So I think that's probably safe to assume that those are probably a mom and pop sort of, or it just wasn't purchased through it. LLC, or maybe someone who moved out of the house and is now renting it, et cetera.
Got it. So I just to bookend that, so there does not appear to be a lurking alternative entity out there, which is, you know, dwarfing LLCs, but is not on our radar. That's the question I want to make sure that we're thinking about.
And I haven't checked, but I could, after this call, take a look and just group by some addresses and just see if there's anything that pops up without it. I was kind of looking through this quickly and used LLCs as a proxy, but I can take a look because I think it's a good question just to see if there's some entity that I'm not aware of. But
Okay. I would be surprised to learn if that was the case, but it would be good for us to know if that was the case.
I would
absolutely.
say anecdotally on that topic, working with real estate investors just as a lender, S corps are probably the second most common that we see for people to buy rental properties in that business entity structure.
Are they typically LLCs though that are S corp, or do you mean like in a INC specifically, or an LLC with an S corp election for tax basis?
For tax basis, but they do business as their business name would be a corporation, not an LLC.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I will take a look also for some of these other entity names.
And I do think within that kind of bigger, broader frame of corporate entity, however it might be listed as an S corp or LLC, I think in talking with the researchers that presented last time, they do in the cleanup of the data set that they've got, I think they do have multiple listing types that they can pull from. But it's more maybe the idea of there's a lot of just people that own a lot of housing units for rent that aren't in a corporate format. And I guess I just want to really make sure that people are well aware that is a large number, larger than I thought. How about that? I was surprised. I thought that more would be in the corporate format, but
Elizabeth, isn't it fair to say that, I mean, that's not really in scope of what we're evaluating, is just overall impact of rental property? Isn't it just the corporation ownership of rental property?
right. And so, but that's, I think, what then is the point, is, and I guess maybe I'm thinking way down the line. So let's say that some kind of legislation with the total goal of trying to, let's say that we do identify that there's a price impact of LLCs, that they just change the format from their legal form from X to Y to avoid whatever legislation. I guess I want to know the big impact. And so I was just, I guess, just very surprised how few LLCs were a share of the total units, single family units, at least in Adams doing this cursory. But I agree with you. I mean, that's what the legislation says. I just want us to be able to think.
Yeah.
Inclusive.
And I would just say again, I think we're all on the same page, but I just want to want to echo that, which is the key finding that I'm seeing from this, but I do think we should at least nail down a little bit more, is there isn't, when we say we're looking at LLCs and we're looking at LLCs that own a bunch of single family rentals, that is the group. When people colloquially are talking about institutional investors, that's the universe that we're looking at, and that there isn't some other entity out there that we're missing, that someone might say, hey, wait a minute, you only looked at LLCs, but there's this other type of corporate entity that owns that, through which these large institutional investors are operating. My belief is that is not the case. My belief is, as we're looking at LLCs and multiple property owning LLCs, that is essentially the universe of the large institutional investors that that the legislation is concerned with. But I want to make sure it's understood that there's not the task force didn't overlook some other entity. So and again, I think it'd be pretty quick, I'm guessing, to make that point.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for those comments. And I think for me, what's been harder is that the legislation doesn't specifically say institutional investors. But I think that that's the target audience, but it doesn't say that. And so how do we manage it when it doesn't specifically say that? And now there's, if we look at the slides, how do we think about entities that are corporations, but aren't operating like an institutional investor? So the lease to own, that's interesting. These purchase sell facilitators like Orchard, that's not their goal, isn't it, as an institutional investor in that sense, like a REIT. This unique situation that came up in Boulder. I mean, that's just an entity that's rehabbing mobile homes, but they're brought up. So I think it's interesting, right? To think about what the legislation says versus what's the real impact, and how do we make sure we keep things kind of very categorized. Does anybody else have any comments on that at all?
Well, I would just agree, I think, with the comment about just making sure it's not just LLC, but are we looking at ownership in Inc. names or other, entities. I think trusts come to mind, but those seem more personal versus corporate. But I think, Elizabeth, you were asking about going the other way and really trying to dive into the single ownership. And I struggle a little bit with, I guess, still why we would want to do that more. So other than kind of the global data that you're providing to show how does corporate ownership compare to just that single ownership?
Yeah, no, I mean, fair. And I think that that's a good point. I guess I'm thinking about when we're looking at economic impact, like on price, for example, that it's going to be very difficult to pull out the corporate owner impact when it's so small relative to the total size of the single family rental. So, and again, for me, it was just more an aha, like I didn't realize the size difference maybe. But good point. I mean, that's the way that also I think the legislation is written.
And if I may jump in just briefly on that. So I think honestly, one of the benefits that this task force can bring to the state is that moment. So what I would just say as a rule of thumb, if Elizabeth Garner is saying aha, looking at data, to me that's exciting in terms of saying here's something that is not well known among the state, especially, I mean, even among people who look at a lot of data every day. And so I would just say I think it's a valuable contribution from the task force to say, look, policy discussions aside, here's the deal. Here is, when we talk about single family home rentals, here's how many we have. Here's how many we believe are owned by mom and pop investors. And here are the total number of we'll call large actors. And here's the total amount that they own. I think that most people, including myself, will be surprised by just simply that catalog, and I think it'll help inform the debate, because the debate is very different if you imagine that there are a lot of corporate entities that own a significant amount of single-family home rentals versus a few that own, as we see in Adams County, very few. So I think just simply staking that out, I think will help, is a contribution this task force can make and would make a difference in terms of the debate. So Lori, I'm sorry, I saw you hit your hands up.
No, you're good. You're good. I just wonder if we could somehow tap into the Secretary of State site to look at some of the LLC, and follow me down this rabbit hole for just a minute. When I worked at Mesa County, when VRBOs became such a big deal, and I understand we're not talking VRBOs, but again, down the rabbit hole, we searched our data by ownership, trying to figure out, you know, is there a certain group that is buying most of these? Do we need to contact them? That sort of thing. What we found is that there will be an LLC formed, and they buy 5 or 6 houses, and a different LLC formed and they buy 5 or 6, and a different LLC, but they're all under the same group. They all share the same agents, they all share. So when they protested, we got protested for all 50 of their houses they own instead of just the 5 or 6. And so I don't know if there's a way to, because that's what we did. I went to the Secretary of State site and started looking up all these people to try and see where they were connected. So we could say, this LLC owns these 5 houses, but collectively, that group that established 7 different LLCs owns 75 houses. So just a thought.
Greg, I think you have some reflection on that point.
Yeah, and just quick, and again, this was an imperfect way of doing this, but how I kind of approached that was by using the owner addresses. So instead of matching on a name for the LLC, I matched on the address for the owner. And it's imperfect, and some of these did have multiple addresses. So like Invitation Homes had 2 different places, but for the most part, you could see large groupings, and they typically, and then how I would match them up to the eventual owner was take those addresses, search, and then you can trace that back to, mostly they went to corporate offices. So again, imperfect, and I think there's a lot more work that could be done on it, but that was a strategy that I employed to look at this.
So more of a mailing address than a physical.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Or
On the
owner
owner
name,
mailing
yeah,
address,
yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
we use that as well because I mean, that was the first step. That's the easiest way to find them, is who has these. I know the Department of Revenue also collects an out-of-state ownership list by statute from all of the assessors. And that might be, Department of Revenue may also be a place we could tap into some information.
Yeah, no, that's interesting on that one as well. To think about the out of state. So super. Any other kind of comments or thoughts on this piece? Again, for me, what it was helpful is to identify some of these corporate owners that we may not be the entities that we're concerned about. And so if everybody's all right, I'd like to start moving over to the scope side, unless somebody has another comment on this area. So I'm going to share my screen, but I also sent it via email to folks as well. And again, it takes me a bit to share my screen, sorry. So what was helpful with that is that then it helped me think about, and I don't mean to scroll too fast. I'm assuming people can see it and you've got your own copies. So really, you know, I think it focuses on these 3 big objectives. One is this whole identification by size in terms of corporate ownership based on the number of units owned. Just like we did for Adams, you know, doing it for, I'm going to recommend really looking at the entire Front Range and then isolating specific counties with large shares of single-family rentals. Some of our counties that don't have a large number, I don't know, you know, we'll be able to identify a big corporate entity, but we can be flexible on that piece. Again, I think the group that presented last time mentioned they've got 17 counties, and we can see if we need to extend that list. But I think we've got a good way to think about identifying the counties to focus on. And then really identify the primary mid, mega, large and mega firms operating in Colorado and what kind of entity they are, so the type. So are they a build to rent? Are they a lease to own? Are they a REIT? Are they private equity? Are they a transaction facilitator? So that it also groups by types that normally would just get bunched into one as a corporate owner, but I think we do want to segment even the corporate owners by the type of work they do. And then, oh, Greg?
Sorry, I didn't actually mean to interrupt necessarily. I just had finished pulling these non-LLC owners with 20 or more properties based on the address. And I pulled up 39 that came up following that, under that in Adams County, and they are mostly INCs as the other that pops up in here. I see one individual name. So just to give a quick background on that. So versus in the total with the multiples, it's around 1,700 where an address is connected to multiple properties.
Super, thank you. That's helpful. And then examine, looking at a representative sample of counties, examine residential real estate transactions by corporate entities over time to identify what could be different economic conditions driving corporate ownership or investor ownership over time. For example, time periods when there might be a lot of foreclosures, which we know that occurred, and that we had some corporate entities coming in and buying during that time frame. Interest rates high, low, supply high, low, those different things to, again, identify what are some of the bigger drivers. And let's see, no, we're going to keep going. Identify characteristics of those corporate home ownership. Again, the type of housing, geographic distribution, so if there's concentrations, property values, age of housing unit, and other demographic factors, you know, like of that area, including race, ethnicity, income. And we might be able to start doing a little bit of that research for maybe 1 or 2 counties. We've got the single family rentals, just as a set that we can do by block group or by tract, and just give some cursory information maybe for the next meeting. And then examine the economic impact of corporate acquisition and ownership. And so looking at how the impact of corporate ownership impacts home ownership rates, access to housing for first-time homebuyers, and property prices. I guess what I'm going to recommend is if you've got any thoughts or questions, mention those now, or you can also submit them via email to Adam or myself with use maybe, the edit function.
Elizabeth, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, please, no, go ahead, Ricky.
I was just going to say a quick comment. I think bullet point number 5 there is going to be the most difficult, just because there are so many variables on what impacts homeownership, accessibility of housing for first-time home buyers, and property prices. That's going to be the challenge to complete that step.
Elizabeth, I'm just going to make the comment that I think, based on the initial data set, we may find that it's not a significant portion of ownership now, but thinking ahead and proactively about the impact if this continues to grow. And so I'm just wondering if there's data from other cities where it's a bigger part, and that may be compelling just to understand, what's the trend in Colorado for ownership over time, but if it gets to a certain point, what is the impact at that point? Because it may not be very impactful right now, but just thinking ahead. So I'm just wondering if there's data that we have from other states that would be helpful.
Super. No, I think I like that.
I would also throw on number 5 is the impact on rents. That is to say, what is the impact of having additional supply of single family home rentals in a market? This, yeah, because we're looking at right now, I mean, which again, it's very important. It's crucial to look at this from a owner occupant standpoint, especially first time home buyers, I think, because that's the product that is the large focus of single family home rental providers typically. But then there's the flip side of that, which is that those homes are now available for rent, and so therefore, I think we should consider that in terms of vacancy and ultimately rental housing costs.
And I'm hearing you, I'm just typing notes. So I can hear this, I can replay it, but I just like to write down the notes real quick. And I agree with you, Frankie, in terms of the difficulties in doing this. And so that'll be interesting in terms of feedback from potential researchers on what is going to be doable and not doable. Agreed. But unfortunately, it was in the legislation. Other thoughts? And then the rest of this is just really goes into detail on the house behind it. The deliverables is then maybe interesting. It follows the same information in terms of the topics, reports on these different pieces, presentation to the task force, timeline. It could be aggressive, but I think we can find that out as well from any comments from researchers. Looking at the first couple of months doing this kind of identification and trends, then looking at economic impact and then presentation to the team or to the task force. Any thoughts on anything? I'm just looking for hands. Required skills, budget, you can see what's there. Proposal submission requirements. I'm curious if anybody has things that they really want to be able to see from someone proposing if that's not included. I'm going to give you a little bit more time to read if you go ahead.
I would just say two quick notes. One would be, I guess this would be under point 1.3 under objectives. Just one thing to note, and it's a wrinkle they're probably going to come up where they're going to find themselves, which is to capture mom and pop operators moving into LLCs. That is to say, we've owned the property, the house that that we used to live in. We moved out of. We had a rental, and now our estate planning attorney has said you can't hold that in your name. You have to do it as an LLC. And so that's a creation of an entity, but it's still a mom and pop entity. And so that would be basically, I mean, the way I would imagine you do that is compare the total amount of of individually owned single family home rentals to LLC owned single family home rentals, and see if you can observe those changes. This not tracking?
Not tracking.
Okay,
No.
so imagine a situation where you have you've got 10 single family home rental owners, just mom and pops, the old, the single family home rental they had over the course of years, and this is particularly the case as workshops have happened and the internet has exploded and all that, where people find it easier to form LLCs. So those same mom and pop operators are now learning that they ought to really own that single family home in an LLC. And so let's say 4 of them do keep operating just like they were before, but transfer that into an LLC. That'll show up in the data as a market increase in the amount of LLC activity, but not in the way that I think matters for the legislation, which is about big corporate owners. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in LLCs, but not a material change in the on-the-ground reality that that I think the task force is charged with looking into. Does that?
Right. No, and I
Yeah.
think that I see that Greg has his hand up, but I think that would be filtered because still that mom and pop, even if it's owned by an LLC, would not reach the threshold that we're potentially interested in. But I think it'll be categorized. So like that group that you saw for Adams County, the number that were less than 5, I can't remember what the first category was huge, was significant. I think that mom and pop would be under that group. But I think it's important, again, to note that not all the ownership type isn't necessarily the clincher. It's the number of units, right?
Yep, much better said than I said it.
And Greg, would you like to share something?
Yeah, I was just going to add quickly to this because when again, on the Adams County, Elizabeth brought this up and I think mostly covered what I was going to mention. But one thing I did want to say is that when I even had that 20 or more, that list of, I think 5 entities that were kind of the large corporate that were there, that was after I kind of looked at all these addresses, and you could see even there's about 20 entities in all that, or addresses that related to 20 or more properties. And a lot of those I filtered out were, it was maybe like a real estate agent or something that it linked to that probably most likely looks like a mom and pop investor. So there were some of those that even show up in some of those larger ownership. And then I suspect as you go further down, you really probably see more of what you're describing there. But
That makes sense.
Yeah, but I think that's another like parking lot point that I think is really critical, that it's that how are things, it's really the I don't want to say the intention, but in a way, if it's a small investor versus a large investor, and if it's not really an investor versus an investor, and it all could be under an LLC.
Yeah, we're looking at behavior and impact as
Right.
opposed to form.
Right, which of course is horrible, because then it's really, I mean, it's not horrible, but it makes it really challenging to classify.
Yep.
So any other comments on the scope? I'm going to stop sharing because I'm scrolling and that's probably going to make people nauseous. Oh, and I want to say hi to Cynthia and Heidi. I didn't see your faces earlier. Sorry, because I was screen sharing. Everybody disappears.
No, my apologies. I had a meeting run over, had a meeting change. I'm sorry to be late.
Oh, totally fine. I'm glad to see you guys. So any thoughts on the scope of what, especially like what was missing?
I just noticed there was, Summer had sent a comment in the Q&A. I don't know if you guys saw that.
No. And so I don't know if Summer, are you, maybe somebody can help me understand. I understand the first comment. And again, I agree. I'm not, I may be distracted slightly by single family ownership, but it's more in terms of I was just curious on the scope or on the size of them. On the second one, it's helpful to understand the corporate ownership and development of apartments for rent versus the development of multifamily housing for purchase. And maybe somebody would like to add more information on that one?
I think you can tell in the data, because if you're building an apartment building, it's just one legal address, multiple units versus single family is, or townhome, or, you know, if it's for sale, it would be separately deeded. But I think that's what you're trying to get to too, Elizabeth, is you can see in the data where there's builders that are, just a transitional time when you're owning it. So I don't know if I totally understand the comment, but it feels like we can understand that piece of like, when is it just a builder that owns it from a transitional point?
Possibly. I wonder if it has something to do with the approach some multifamily developers have taken in building apartments now, but setting them up initially so they can be converted to condos if the condo defect law is resolved in the state. I don't know. Pass.
Right. No, I mean, I think that that's a good point. And again, I'm kind of creating a list of these, I don't want to say exceptions, but things that need to be taken into consideration if any kind of legislation were to ever be written of, you know, what do we need to be careful, and people should be careful or thoughtful about in terms of that. Anything else that people have thoughts on? I mean, this is a really good, and again, don't feel like this is your only time. You can definitely send email thoughts, but it's fun to talk about them.
I just wanted to
Go ahead,
offer,
Adi.
Elizabeth, that I think the timeline is pretty aggressive. And so you may want to offer an opportunity for a response firm to offer an alternative timeline. If
Sounds
possible.
good.
I'm gonna, since you've opened it up to general comments, under the transaction deliverable, the transaction trend analysis, I would just, I think you've captured it well in the term transaction, but I guess what I would suggest is explicitly talking about both purchases and sales. And the reason I say that is because it seems most of the data that I've seen have been about purchases, and what we're really, you know, well, at least what I'm thinking mostly about is the accumulation of single family home rentals in large corporate entities. And so again, the scenario where you have an entity that is buying just as many as they are selling, we're seeing more transactions, but we're not seeing an accumulation. And actually for one of your first slides actually shows a decrease in single family home rentals in general. And so I think that suggests to me that it is an important question to look at, and so that would be my wish. We'll see if they grant that, in terms of if they're able to measure the stock and the flow.
Right. And at least at a minimum, more point in time. So like if you can look at these different points where we knew that there were maybe some inflection points in economic conditions that would incentivize either buying or selling. But that net number is interesting, right? And actually I want to encourage that everybody has taken maybe a look at all of the different, I think we added maybe 5 or 6 documents to the portal thing. Engage Dolosite over the last maybe month and a half, and getting into more like the behaviors of REITs, like how do they act and what are their incentives versus different types of structures, as well as then like behavior recently. You know, I think a lot of the documents were indicating that purchases had really slowed down the corporate entity types. But it's a good question if the sales have slowed down. So I think you're right that it's important to focus on the two sides.
And Greg, since it came up that we're looking at points in time, I would throw out bank-owned properties. I'd be very interested to know REOs, which would be a very different type of corporate entity insofar, again, as I believe that the legislature is concerned with. So I would want to make sure that we clarify that, especially it's going to be in 2011, 2012. You'll see a lot of corporate owned, but it'd be US Bank or something like that.
Adam, it looks like you've got a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight some of the background work we've been doing about REITs. They're a unique tax structure, which kind of limits the ability to sell homes without major penalties. And apparently there are workarounds for that, but it's that the companies that are, transacting homes, buying and selling are not necessarily these REITs, but most of what Greg identified, most of the entities that Greg identified as being these large corporate entities are REITs. So they may be limited in the, how much they can transact. They can acquire homes apparently, but they have to hold them for a while, and that there are some limits to the number that they can sell each year, apparently. And that's not to throw a complete wrench into this, but that it also complicates some of those concerns, I think.
Super, thank you, Adam. Lori?
I also think we have to recognize currently what the interest rates are doing to buying and selling.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
That is a huge impact on, I wanted to reread the bill again because sometimes I get lost in what my thoughts are, and I'm like, get back to what the bill says. And it does, talk about foreclosures, and it talks about that we're looking specifically at single family homes, condominiums, and townhomes, and first time buyers and all of that. And, Chaffa has a wonderful program. There are some other great programs out there, but I know in what I do, talking with people, it's not so much affordability right now, it's interest rates. And so I think that has to at least be part of our discussion or reporting, the history of the interest rates from 2008 and what those have done as well.
Yes. So I will maybe make sure that that's explicit. Super, thank you. What other thoughts? All right, so this is not over. You have a chance still to send more thoughts as you feel inclined. As we move closer to a final, I will shoot that out to you guys again in case you have additional comments. So I guess now I'd like to reopen the topic of additional presentations. Or what do you guys want? What do you guys want to hear? What can we bring to you that would help you? What do you feel like you're missing?
Elizabeth, I have to look through some of the material online, but I do wonder if some of the people that have written those articles or done those studies would be good to have just as speakers to, that we can they can provide more updated information. We can ask questions. So happy to look through that and maybe send some suggestions.
That would be really appreciated. So I know that, and maybe one of you guys have had interactions with them. So there is this like National Association of like single family renter, or what is it, Adam? It's National Association of Corporate Owners. Are you there, Adam?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm trying to, of course, I'm having a brain issue. I can't.
You're
I
having the
can't find-
same brain freeze I'm having.
Yes, I am. So
But
let
basically,
me,
it seems like it's an association of folks that have large sets of rentals. It might be interesting to hear from them. I mean, I'm always curious what, you know, what they're dealing with, what their issues are, what they're thinking about, any of those pieces. But certainly, as you look through any of those articles, or Leah's been really good at, you know, she's attends conferences and then shares the material. The Rental Home Council, thank you, Nancy. Whatever you guys, you know, we need topics that you guys would like, and potential speakers, because we don't know probably as many people as you guys know. Want to leverage you.
I'll definitely think it over and reach back. I'm guessing that's what other people on the task force are doing right now, is cycling through that. But I will follow up with the email.
You know, and certainly want to leverage you guys properly. So, you know, as either assessors, as clerk and recorders, as bankers, anything that you would want to share and give more information to the entire task force on, in terms of what you've been seeing or involved with or understand from, you know, just even I will tell you, like the assessor and clerk recorder side of things, how things are recorded and maintained. I will tell you, you know, I do have a very narrow focus in terms of, you know, more on the data analysis side, but playing with the data, working with the data, I don't really mean playing, working with the data is a huge challenge. And that might be an interesting, in my mind, topic to talk about. Anything else? What other, please be thinking, and we'll reach out after this as well and beg for topics. We may also try and start interacting with some of the data of like Summit County, for example, see if there's any weird issues that come up in just like an initial play. Another interesting one for me is still El Paso County, just because it's got the largest number, and maybe Pueblo, to see if just there's some interesting issues going on that we should be aware of in terms of the research. But Frankie, it looked like you had taken your mute.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking about how to properly ask this. I'm looking back at the bill summary. I just want to remind myself on that. And one of the charges is to make legislative recommendations to mitigate any negative impacts related to corporate ownership of housing identified by the task force. And so I'm just thinking, as we think about speakers, that negative impacts, negative to whom? Are we looking at this from a consumer perspective? Are we from a renter's perspective? Possibly home buyers? I don't know, and just thinking through that and who perhaps we should still hear from as we define that.
Any recommendations on that end? I think you're right. There's typically two sides of anything that could be negative.
Right. like rising property values could be viewed negatively or positively, depending on who you're speaking to. So I don't know, just want to think about that a little bit more.
I agree that if nothing else, fleshing that out more to identify the specific stakeholders, to make sure that we're being all inclusive in terms of who we're looking at. I think I think that step alone, I think is a good educational step for this group.
I know Representative Sharbini has stepped down and we have the replacement, but maybe it would be helpful again. Are the other bill sponsors, Rep. Lindsay and Senator Henriksen, still active?
They intend to be active.
Okay. I just think maybe it'd be helpful to hear from them again.
Perfect.
On the intent with the bill.
Elizabeth, I wonder if having someone, as Frankie was talking, I was thinking, I used to meet with like the realtors in town quarterly. And once in a while, the president of the real estate association, I'm sure that's not exactly what it's called, but would come to those meetings and talk about Colorado as a whole. I wonder if we could contact some of the real estate companies and see if there is a representative that could come and talk about, because again, reading in the bill, they're talking about, you know, decreased housing availability, first-time home buyers, increased rental property prices. I know my realtor friends have a pretty good handle on that. I wonder if there is somebody at a state level that could come and speak to that.
I think the Colorado Association of Realtors might have
Thank
an
you.
expert.
Thank you, Leah. That's what it was. Colorado Real Estate. Yep. Yes. I don't know who that person is. I can certainly try and find out, Elizabeth, if that would be helpful, versus pushing that off on someone else. But I mean, they have a thumbprint on what's going on with, you know, all the real estate. So maybe we need somebody to come and talk about what's happening in Colorado.
I think that's a great idea, and they ask me to speak to their group all the time, so I think it's fair that I can ask them to speak to our group. So I
Do
will
you have a contact then?
Yeah, I do have a
Okay.
contact, but if I have any issues, I will reach out to you guys to see if somebody else has a piece. That's a really good idea. That was a really good suggestion. Any other groups like that you think would be beneficial to hear from?
I just a thought. I mean, you all may have already talked about this, but it would be interesting, I think, to hear from like impacted populations. And I don't know the advocacy group that would be able to bring those folks together, but I do feel like very appropriately, the folks we're talking to are academics who have studied this, or people who are on the transactional side, but the like residents who may have had their, have experienced sort of displacement, or maybe been able to benefit from some of these transactions. I don't know like what that one group is to pull those folks together. I'd have to give that a little bit of thought, but it does feel like that's a group we should be hearing from as well.
Heidi, I wonder if it's somebody at CHFA. CHFA plays such a large role and is the state's administrator for like the Prop 123 money. So it's a big organization, but they have the pulse on what's happening throughout the state.
Yeah, they may have a recommendation.
Impact Development Fund is another one, potentially.
What is
Yeah,
Impact Development
Colorado
Fund?
Center for Law and Policy, or Eviction Defense Project, those groups. may have sort of be able to bring sort of lived experience, or else talk on behalf of lived experience.
I'd throw on their Brothers Redevelopment might be a good group, just because they are at the intersection of providing a lot of services to Colorado residents.
Now, Elizabeth, I had reached out to the Mortgage Bankers Association for some data, and they sent it to me. I think I have one email that I still need to put in the portal, but they rely on a company called CoreLogic for a lot of their data. So I actually have a contact at CoreLogic I can reach out to as well to see if they would speak with us.
All right, so this is a good group. Maybe make sure if you had a recommendation that you put it in the chat so I don't lose it. Anything else? Right. Any other comments? So just open forum. Any other comments that you have that you feel like you didn't get to say?
Elizabeth, are you going to post the presentation you gave today on our website so we can access it? That I just would like to look at it again. That was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that will be posted on both the main, the Engagedilla as well as the main site. Any other comments? So right now we're looking at the next meeting would be June 26th. Is there any conflict with that one? And we'll see if we can set somebody up to speak at that time. All right.
Elizabeth, I'm unavailable June 26th. My daughter's getting married the 28th, so I will be out.
Yay!
So, yeah, yay. I could try and jump in. I just can't promise I can be there, but I can always go back and watch anything presented or any of that. So I'm happy to do that as well, if that date works for everyone else.
Perfect. Well, congratulations. And yeah, no, that's the nice thing about recording this. All right, so now we'd like to open it up for public comment. And Adam, if you'll manage that. If there's anybody
yeah.
that would like.
So if you are one of the attendees, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we can unmute you. I guess not.
I'll give it maybe another 10,
Yeah.
15 seconds in case you're struggling to raise your hand. Or you can, I guess you could also throw it in the Q&A. All right. Upon not hearing anything else. Oh, wait, I see something in the Q&A. Oh, it was a thank you. That's always appreciated. All right. So I want to thank you guys for your time this morning. Appreciate all of the feedback and information. And again, if you've got any additional comments on the scope of work that you didn't get a chance to mention this morning, please get me information by Friday, and we will move from there. Just kind of waiting to see if anybody was going to say anything. All right. So thank you guys so much. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.